Thank you so much. I hope I'm audible over the connection. Can you hear me okay? Great. Um, I'm very pleased to be joining you. I'm sorry I wasn't able to catch more than the last 10 minutes of your discussion. It's 8 a.m. here, so thank you for accommodating my time zone. Um, my title for today is How to Build Language Processing Applications That Work and Expose Those That Don't. This is deliberately quite provocative. Um, if you would like to connect with me on social media, I am still for the moment on Twitter at Emily M. Bender, and I'm trying out Mastodon, so I've put that link there too, though I might be changing servers. Um, I don't know how smooth that transition is. Anyway, that's where you can find me. The other important piece of information on this slide is that I've made a bit.ly link where you can download the slides yourself, and in particular get the bibliography at the end. That link will be on this slide, the next slide, and the final slide. So my goals here are to try to convince you all that it is worth thinking about how to scope NLP applications so that they are actually sensible, give you some tools about how to detect wild claims that are out there, and I'm hoping that some folks in this room are actually among those who are involved these days in policy discussions, and that perhaps my talk can help raise the overall level of understanding of these systems in those discussions. Perhaps you are already experts. Perhaps I can give you something more to bring into the discussions. As an outline, I'm going to tell you just a little bit about where I'm coming from, and then spend some time giving you a linguist's view of the relationship between form and meaning. And I think that that is really one of the main things that the field of linguistics can contribute to this debate. Talk some about the opportunities and dangers for NLP and the law. And there you're going to see that I'm quite naive about the law side of things, but hopefully this will still be beneficial. And then I have a series of questions to ask of proposed applications. And they're in two batches. One is some questions to help us determine if this thing is or could be effective. And then the second set of questions have to do with whether it is or could be appropriate. And then I've put together 4 case studies where I go through those questions around proposed or just imagined applications. And hopefully there will be time. If I'm running out of time, I will cut out one or more of those case studies. If we have lots of time, it could be fun to run through the questions with a particular application that someone has in mind. All right, so who am I? My training is all in linguistics, primarily syntax and sociolinguistics. So my degrees, bachelor's, master's, PhD, all in linguistics. And I have the longest experience working with multilingual grammar engineering. So this is building grammars in software across mostly spoken languages. I have been running our professional master's in computational linguistics since it began in 2005. And that has given me reason to sort of interact with the field very broadly, but also to engage in this discussion within computational linguistics of the role of linguistics in our field. And as part of my work running that program, I was advised by our advisory board in 2016 to make sure to include some curricular content around ethics or societal impacts. And at first I was like, okay, well, I'll get someone to come teach that. Couldn't find anybody. So I figured it was me who needed to do it. So I spent a bunch of time in 2016 gathering everything I could about the societal impact of language technology in particular, and then taught a seminar on that for the first time in 2017. And that has since become a major research strand of mine. And that brings me into this broader conversation about identifying and mitigating harms done in the name of so-called AI. And I like to put scare quotes around that because I think that it was a huge mistake to call these systems artificial intelligence from the beginning. It's what Drew McDermott calls a wishful mnemonic, and that just muddies the whole debate, the whole discussion. Okay, so I promised you that I would talk about the relationship between form and meaning from the point of view of a linguist. And this is a conversation that I frequently have with computer scientists who seem to mistake text for information, and it's not. And sometimes I can get the point across with this slide, where I want you to think about what does this sentence that I'm going to show you mean, or what might a speaker mean by uttering this sentence. Here's the sentence. I'm guessing there's at least a couple people in the audience for whom they know immediately what this sentence means and what a speaker might mean by uttering the sentence. And for the rest of you, You might have a guess as to which language it is. I'll clear that up. It's Japanese. Didn't help you understand the sentence, did it? Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put some white space between words-ish. The word boundaries are a little bit unclear in Japanese. Did that get you any closer to understanding this sentence? If you don't read Japanese, probably not. How about I transliterate this into the romanization? Now you might pick up a couple of words. I'm guessing for many English speakers, sensei and Pokemon are familiar words. And now you're getting a sense of, oh, maybe I know something about what the sentence is about. Here are glosses of the content words in that sentence. So even if you didn't recognize sensei and Pokemon, now I've got those for you as teacher and Pokemon. And we also have words for boy, girl, and like. Maybe a little bit more of a guess about what's going on with this sentence. Now I'm glossing the function words. So word by word, this is teacher, according to boy, than, girl, nominative, Pokemon, nominative, like, and then the present tense copula. And when I do this interactively, I usually get somebody at this point willing to tell me they think they know what it means and they're wrong because they don't know the syntax of Japanese. So this sentence actually means, according to the teacher, girls like Pokemon more than boys do. What's my point here? It's not a point about Pokemon. It's a point that the text doesn't contain the meaning. The text is just form, and you can only construct the meaning if you actually have linguistic knowledge, if you know the meanings of words, if you know the grammar rules, and if you know the meanings that have to do with the way the words are put together, then you can go from that string to a representation of the sentence meaning. So that's basically the first bullet point here. If you have linguistic, that is grammatical and lexical knowledge of the relevant language, then you can get from a text to what Grice and Quine call the standing or conventional meaning. But that's only the first step, because to figure out what the person meant by uttering it, you take that standing meaning, you take various common sense shared context, you take what's called coherence relations. How does that standing meaning fit into what else is going on in this discourse? And from that, you can get to what's called the public commitments, the thing that the person has gone on record as saying by uttering that sentence. And then you can go even further, looking at further reasoning to get to what we call perlocutionary consequences. So further inferences we can make about what the person said or believes, but they are not publicly committed to. And so this little dialogue comes from my colleague Alex Laskarides. Person A says, I wonder whether I should take my umbrella. Is it raining? And person B says, yes. And person A says, oh, so you do think I should take my umbrella. And B can quite legitimately say, I didn't say that, right? That's just further reasoning based on the context, but they aren't publicly committed to that. They're only publicly committed to the claim that it's raining, but they didn't even say it's raining. They just said yes in a context where the coherence relations add up to that. So all of this to say that when linguists zoom in on speech acts and utterances, we see much more structure. So, if you picture what happens with electron microscopes, or something that looks like it's just dusty surface or sand, you zoom in and there's all this structure there. This is what linguists can do with language. So we see at least 5 different things. There's the words that were uttered with one or more possible grammatical structures. Then one or more standing meanings that correspond to the grammatical structures. Then the speaker's publicly committed communicative intent. Then further inferences that listeners can make about the speaker's beliefs. And that is still different than the actual state of the world. And keeping all of these things separate is really, really important, and stands in contrast to people who claim they are learning world knowledge by having a computer go through and do something with all of those words that were uttered in writing Wikipedia. That sort of just collapses all of these different levels of structure. And here's where I really wish I was in the room so I could see if people are nodding or not, but I'm just going to press ahead. So in this context, as noted, one of the things that I have spent a lot of time doing is pushing back against the claim that language models can understand. Language models are systems that are designed to do predictions of words given either their surrounding words or all the previous words. So it is just text synthesis. And so I wrote a paper with Alexander Kohler in 2020, where we gave sort of a theoretical argument that there's no way that these things can understand because their training data is only form. So if we look at language as a symbolic system, we have the forms, which are marks on a page, or pixels or bytes, or movements of the articulators, so the vocal tract or the hands and face, depending on spoken versus signed languages. Meaning, on the other hand, is a relationship between linguistic form and something external to language. And we actually looked at two different versions of what we call the meaning relation. So the one that has to do with what you really want to get to, which is communicative intent. So that's a relationship between expressions and communicative intents. But if you think about linguistic knowledge and what it means to know a language, then you have access to this meaning relation C, which is pairs of expressions and their standing meanings. So in this context, understanding is I'm looking at an expression E, some linguistic form, in a context. Can I recover the communicative intent I? And my argument is that language models can never have any hope of doing that because they never ever get to see anything that would give them information about I. They only get E. And when we look at their training data, we have information about I because we have all of this other knowledge of the linguistic system, of the shared context, of the shared experiences of being human. And the language models don't have that to start with. So to try to make this more vivid, Alexander and I put together a thought experiment involving two stranded travelers and an octopus. So the scenario is this. We have travelers A and B. They're stranded on these islands where previous people had been stranded and somehow managed to create a telegraph line that goes under the water. It's thought experiments. We can have spherical cows. We can have telegraph lines that are just out there in the ocean. It's fine. Along comes a hyper-intelligent deep sea octopus. And a key difference here between the octopus and the language models is we are positing that the octopus is actually intelligent because that's not what's at issue here. What's at issue is, can something that only has access to form, no matter how intelligent, actually get to meaning? So the octopus is super intelligent, and it taps into this telegraph line and it picks up the pulses, which are the Morse code that A and B are using to communicate with each other in English, and listens in. And eventually the octopus decides that it wants to play along, so it cuts the telegraph line and starts impersonating B to A. So A sends the signal that adds up to "what a pretty sunset," and the octopus can guess that B in that situation might have said things like "reminds me of lava lamps," because those are the kinds of words that would follow a "what a pretty sunset" remark once the octopus had listened long enough. Then A might say something like, "I made a coconut catapult, let me tell you how." And the octopus can say, "Cool idea, great job," but can't actually follow the directions and make it and give any feedback. And then it really falls apart when A has an actual need, not just communicating for fun. So help, I'm being chased by a bear. All I have is a stick. What do I do? And the octopus has no way to understand that. It won't have shown up in the training data, so there's no previous pattern to rely on. So we tried this with the GPT-2 demo, which is what was available to us as we wrote this paper in 2019. And GPT-2 replied, "The bear is chasing me," which isn't helpful. And also, "You're not going to get away with this." Also not helpful. Okay, so our analysis of what came to be called the octopus test is that the octopus did not learn to communicate successfully. And the reason is that it did not learn meaning. And that in turn is because the octopus, as intelligent as we posited it to be, could still only observe forms, and the meaning just simply isn't available to be learned from form alone. If the octopus were to learn the meaning relation, then it would have needed access to the outside world so that communicative intents could be hypothesized and tested, and it just didn't have that access. So, to the extent that A is fooled and finds O's utterances meaningful, it's not actually because O's utterances made sense. It's because A, as a human active listener, could make sense of them. And this is where we really get tripped up with the language models, because out comes this coherent seeming text and we can't help ourselves. So, can machines understand language? Speaking about language models, the answer is clearly no. So this is things like GPT-3 and Palm and Lambda and others. They are only trained on form. They have no access to meaning, so therefore they can't understand. What about in general? I'd say that really depends on how they were designed. So when you interact with a virtual assistant, one of these voice-based assistants, and you ask it to turn on a light or place a phone call or report what the weather is outside, and it does those things for you, then it has mapped the expression that you uttered to a communicative intent, and when it's got the right one, it has successfully understood. But the point is that those are a narrowly scoped set of capabilities, and not the sort of general can understand anything we might talk about um, facade that we get when we see what the language models are doing. So I go around asking people to resist the urge to be impressed by these things. The ersatz fluency of large language models presents a risk because we can't help but make sense of their output. And so we have to guard against that risk. And to the extent now that we have some people who think that these things are not only understanding, but they're actually sentient, to which I say, we now have machines that can mindlessly generate words, but we haven't learned how to stop imagining a mind behind those words. And we need to up those skills, especially as we're making consequential decisions about which technology to build and deploy. All right, so this brings me to the machine learning tech solutionism danger zone. There are many cases where it would be really nice to have a system which can determine some output Y with only X's as input. And in many of those cases, we can find or scrape together data sets that have both X and Y related to each other. And then we can train a machine learning system that takes X's and outputs Y's and looks like it's doing the task that we wished for. And in fact, it will be right by chance some of the time, if these are tasks where we can actually check whether it's right. But that doesn't mean it's doing it in a reliable fashion or that we should put it out there in the world and have people believe that it is now doing that task the way we as humans understand the task to be. And there's a couple of things that will push us into this danger zone. One is cases where we have a lack of funding to hire people to do the task. So I see this coming up a lot in medical and especially mental health contexts where there aren't enough people who are trained to do this work and there's a lot of need. And so it's like, well, maybe we could get machines to do it for us. That doesn't mean that the machines are actually a good choice. And the other place where we get pushed into this danger zone is we see that humans are fallible and we hold hope that machines could be fairer or better, right? And this is something that I think I see coming up in computational law, where we really want the law to be applied equally and fairly, and we know that humans hold biases. So couldn't we be better off with an unbiased computational system? Well, we don't get unbiased computational systems because those are also artifacts that are built by people. Before anybody goes and claims that they are unbiased, they need to go read the work of scholars like Ruha Benjamin, like Sophia Noble, like Abeba Berhane and Deb Raji and many others. There's a sort of pithy version of it in Ruha Benjamin's Race After Technology. The road to inequity is paved with technical fixes. So just because it would be nice to have a technical fix, and just because we can build a system that looks like it's doing what we want, doesn't mean we should trust it. Furthermore, language is extremely flexible and powerful. We can describe many tasks as language input, language output, and that makes it seem like it's possible to actually recast those tasks as what computer scientists call sequence-to-sequence problems, things that can be approached with sequence-to-sequence models, sequence of language in, sequence of language out. You can look at machine translation that way, fair, at least for a certain kind of usage of translation. You can look at automatic summarization that way. Again, not useless, but needs to be contextualized in terms of what kinds of things it might miss. And then furthermore, law takes place in language. So language technology, I imagine, is especially appealing. And there are definitely legitimate legal NLP tasks, but there's also an enormous scope for illegitimate ones. And so we have the problem of telling between them. Okay, so this brings me to my two key questions. Anytime someone is proposing or selling a legal NLP system, we should be asking, is it effective and is it appropriate? Is it effective? I've broken down into these, that looks like 7 questions. So what's the input? What's the output? What other data sources are being used? And then, is there enough information in the input to actually determine the output? What are the failure modes? So, what are the different ways in which it can be wrong, and what are the possible causes of failure? And then, how is it evaluated? And in particular, if you get this, like, this has 97% accuracy, you have to say, okay, on what test? And how does that test relate to what it is that I want this system to do? And here I'm going to point to the large and growing literature on data set and model documentation that can help us make those decisions. So these are the is it effective questions. There's also the is it appropriate questions. So we should start by asking, how does the automatic task actually fit into human processes? So what are the humans going to be doing with the output? How are the humans preparing the input? What information should the developer make transparent to the user? So those humans who are interacting with the system, what do they need to know about it? How does automating this task in this way shift or consolidate power? Who might be harmed when the system gives the wrong output, as it inevitably will sometimes? And who might be harmed even if the system gives the right, or right in scare quotes, output? And then it's also always worth asking, is there even a ground truth of right and wrong? Right? If there's no ground truth of right and wrong and we're deferring to a system, we may as well be using the magic 8-ball, which is this toy that at least we had here in the US, where you asked it a yes/no question, and you shook the thing up, and then it would display one of, I think, 6 answers, which are like definitely, probably, yes, maybe, it seems so, or something. It's like things along those lines. You can use that as a way to make decisions, but at least that is transparent, that it is purely random. And if we are trying to put automation into places where there's not a ground truth of right and wrong, we may well be basically shaking a magic 8-ball. Okay, so looks like I will have time for the case studies. The first one, this is one that I've made up as something that felt like a plausible use case. So forgive me if I'm being super naive about law here, but I'm imagining a scenario where we have two parties who are opposing each other in litigation, and through the process of discovery, there's now a whole bunch of data, and they are digging through the data provided by the opposing party to find things that are relevant to their case. And in that scenario, it might be very useful to get out a list of the named entities, people's, places, products, organizations, etc., that are referred to in those documents. And that task in NLP is known as named entity recognition. So here the input is text documents that have been provided in a legal case, and the output is spans within those documents that are referring to people, places, products, and organizations, and then you could post-process that output to get a list, for example. What other data sources might be used? Sometimes in named entity recognition, there's something called a gazetteer, which is literally a list of named entities that can help in finding some of them. If you're using a language model, so BERT or something bigger, then it's worth taking a look at what the training data was for that. So if your language model was trained on Wikipedia, that, like, how good of a match is that for the domain that these documents have come from? And is there enough information in the input to determine the output? I would say frequently, yes. Frequently, you can get pretty close to a complete list of the entities referred to just by looking at the text. If you have information about what are named entities in this language, if you have a dictionary of words that frequently show up in named entities, and so on. So this feels plausible to me. Still, in the is it effective, what are the failure modes? So we could have cases where there's a named entity that the system missed, didn't get flagged. We have a named entity that's flagged but mislabeled, so it's actually a person, but it was labeled as an organization. Or we could have a false positive, so something that was just an ordinary part of language, not a named entity, was flagged. What are the possible causes of failure? Well, there's ambiguity in language all the time. So you have something where named entities, for example, oftentimes the names of books and movies are just ordinary phrases and sentences that then become the proper name of the book or the movie. And so if you run across that string, there's an ambiguity. You might also get more failures if there's a mismatch between the training data and the test context. And then we can ask also, how is it evaluated? So here I would say, before you pick up this named entity recognition system to apply in this context, you want to look for a data statement or a data sheet or something similar to that that thoroughly documents what was the training data, what was the test data for this particular system, so you can judge whether it's a good match to your use case. Okay, so now we're on to the is it appropriate questions. How does this automated task fit into human processes? So here I'm just imagining, but I'm imagining that there's maybe a paralegal whose job it is to find regions of the documents to focus on, and doing this search via the named entities might help them in that process. What information should that user know about the system? Well, it'd be good for them to know what kind of data it was tested over, again, information about the training data. Could have put this on the slide. What's its false positive, false negative rate, so they can decide how important it is to look beyond the output of the system. And how does this shift or consolidate power? Here, what I was able to come up with is if certain kinds of work are more efficient or inexpensive, then that might make it possible for more people to actively engage and push back through these kinds of legal actions, but it might also make it easier for people with power to take legal action. So maybe a wash, I don't know, would take more analysis. Who might be harmed when the system gives the wrong output? In the case of a false positive, I guess you've got the paralegal wasting their time, which leads to the client having extra fees. If there's a false negative, it's probably the client who's harmed because there may have been key information that could have made their case stronger that was missed. Who might be harmed even if the system gives the right output? Well, if the system really helps consolidate power because it makes things more efficient and gets used in that way, then I guess there's possible indirect harms. And in this case, is there even a ground truth of right and wrong? I would say yes, for a given definition of entity types. So what's a person, what's an organization, and so on. There's pretty solid footing there where you could look at the thing and say, that was a wrong answer, that was a right answer. All right, so that was case study number 1. I wanted to come up with at least 2 case studies where I feel like, yeah, this is a plausible application before I dig into the ones that I think are terrible. So here's my second one, which is an inclusive language grammar checker. And so what I'm imagining here is a scenario where there's some legacy legal code, so either laws or regulations that were written without inclusive language. So for example, in English, this would typically be he, him pronouns for all persons referenced. I know it gets far more complicated in languages with more elaborate grammatical gender systems. So French and German have this in spades, where not just the pronouns, but lots and lots of things have gender marking, and there's moves towards developing inclusive language. So the output here would be at least the spans within the documents that need to be updated, and possibly suggested rephrasings. If you've got a particular version of inclusive language that you're aiming for, you could imagine writing software that would provide those suggestions. What are the other data sources being used? So there's probably a rule-based morphological or syntactic grammar involved, and there might be training data for a language model or word vectors, especially when you're talking about, so I'm thinking about German, where all of the names for roles and jobs that people have are gendered. Picking those up would probably be helped by having a language model, because that gives you a way to say these words are similar to each other. So you can find out that the word for, baker is similar to the word for chef, is similar to the word for, going a little bit further away, worker or something. And so that could help find this. Is there enough information in the input to determine the output? I would say frequently yes. That, there's going to be some cases of ambiguity, but again, for the most part, looking at text, if you are a competent speaker of the language, you can find the bits that are written without inclusive language and would need changing. What are the failure modes? This is very similar to the last one. So non-inclusive language is not flagged, or the suggested rephrasing is not correct or not usable for some reason, or a string other than non-inclusive language is flagged. Those are the false positives. What are possible causes of failure? If you're doing this with a lexicon rule-based system, and the lexicon's incomplete, then it's going to miss some things. And so on, right? If the grammar for producing the inclusive version has a bug in it, then you could get unusable ones. How is this evaluated? Again, you want to look at what data in particular was it evaluated on. So if someone wrote an inclusive language grammar checker and they were thinking about job ads, that might not be a great match for legal codes because the language is different. All right, on to the is it appropriate questions. How does this automated task fit into human processes? An example here I'm imagining is you've got someone working to redraft legal codes, and they have to find all the places that need updating in this way. So what does that person need to know? Well, they need a clear idea of its accuracy and what kind of data it was tested over, and then information about the training data again, so they know how much to rely on it. How much time should they spend looking for cases that were missed, for example? Or when they see these suggested ones and they're not sure if it's right, how much should they trust the system versus doing some further research on their own to figure it out? How does this shift or consolidate power? Well, facilitating a move to more inclusive language, I think, can help redress gender-based power differentials. So this would be a power shift. And partially automating this process might reduce resistance to it, given that, if you're talking about languages where we're still working out what does the inclusive language look like, it might be, oh, we shouldn't change the legal codes yet because we might do a different inclusive language in 10 years. But if the process is relatively streamlined because you can use these tools, then that lowers the cost of doing it if it has to be redone. All right, who might be harmed when the system gives the wrong output? A false positive, so the person doing the redrafting has their time wasted. False negative is a bit more serious because if it's not caught through some other process, then you have people who are subject to now incoherent laws, right? What happens if you have some piece of it left only referring to masculine and that's now interpreted as literally male people? How do you resolve that? Who might be harmed even if the system gives the right output? Probably no one. This one seems pretty benign. And then is there a ground truth of right and wrong here? Yes. All right, so these were my two imagined examples of I'm happy with this use of language technology. The other two I'm taking from things that are out there in the world, not in the sense of being used in the world, but in the sense of in the research world. And these are ones that I'm not happy with. So the first one is a study on prison term prediction. This was a paper that was published at EMNLP 2019, and their task is basically take a case description and predict the judgment in terms of what's the prison term that's going to be applied to the defendant. And there's a nice response and analysis by Kobe et al. From the following year at ACL 2020. So what's the input? As I understand it, it's a description of the charges laid against the defendant, and the output is the length of the prison term that retrospectively in the data set was given to that defendant. But when this is used as prediction, I guess it's a should be, not a was. What are the other data sources that are being used? They are apparently using word embeddings, but I couldn't find the source corpus for that. And is there enough information in the input to determine the output? I would say clearly not, because charges are not the only input to sentencing. That's not how what I would recognize as a functioning legal system works. What are the failure modes? Well, recommendation of too long or too short of a prison term, I suppose, where, in the case where the person should have been found not guilty, anything over 0 is too long. What are the possible causes of failure? I would say just a flat out bad task tech fit. The authors note that the system can get tripped up by numerals, low frequency named entities, and complicated charge descriptions. So they're sort of assuming task tech fit and saying, oh, but we still have these little problems here and there. But I think this is just a bad idea to start with. How is it evaluated? So they have a data set that comprises 200,000 cases from the Supreme People's Court of China. And they were using train test splits over that. So that data set represents a certain period of time. It represents a certain status of the laws. It represents, there's a bunch of specificity there. All right, how does this fit into human processes? In their ethical considerations section, interestingly, not in the introduction, but actually under ethical considerations, their recommendation was that this could be an anonymous checker used during the review phase of sentencing. So the idea is that the judge who's hearing the case makes a decision, and then those decisions are reviewed later by other judges, and one of them could be the system. So what information should the developer make transparent to the user? Thinking about the judges who are in charge of reviewing decisions, there's an interesting question. If we went down this path, and I really don't think we should, but if someone went down this path, should the other judges know which prediction was provided by an algorithm so that they can contextualize it in that way. My sort of gut reaction is yes, but the big risk there is what's called automation bias, where people think, oh, well, the computer said it, and it's going to be more objective, so I'm going to defer to it. But they're not more objective. They're just pattern matchers and pattern reproducers. And then under this what info should be provided question, I also want to ask what transparency can be offered to defendants. I think people really ought to know if their cases are being decided algorithmically. How does this shift or consolidate power? Well, it seems like it's likely to consolidate state power by giving a veneer of objectivity to sentencing decisions and or making it seem like humans are actually helpless to intervene. Well, that's what the algorithm said. Sorry, right? Who might be harmed when the system gives the wrong output? Well, defendants with reduced recourse to challenge poor decisions. Who might be harmed even if the system gives the right output? Well, those same defendants with reduced recourse. And I think society at large, given that power shift and shift away from accountability of humans. Is there even a ground truth of right and wrong? I don't think so here, right? There's a ground truth of what happened in the previous court cases, but there is no ground truth of that was necessarily the right decision. And so when we look to the future and we get a decision, there's no very clear cut, this is a right decision, that's a wrong decision. And so we need systems where we have human accountability and space for human discussion and decision making and so on. All right, case study number 4. This one comes out of the Big Bench series of tasks. And I'm sort of put the information backwards because I think the description, this paragraph comes further down the page that I'm quoting than the previous one. So what is this task trying to measure? It's set like a game in a courtroom where language models evaluate their own ability to act as lawyers, that is, to present and argue both sides of a debate, to act as an unbiased judge listening to two lawyers, that is, to ask the right questions that steer the debate in a conclusive direction, and 3, to act as a third party or a bystander to evaluate the performance of the judge. So this is the self-evaluation courtroom. And I think, so this is, I think, a terrible idea, but it is in the first instance set up to evaluate language models, not to be a tool that people actually use in a justice system. But that said, the motivation in the presentation of this task includes 3 questions. Can language models bring justice? Clearly not. Can they argue court cases like lawyers? No. And can they be fair court judges? No, because none of these things are tasks that involve only manipulating linguistic form, and that's what language models do. All right. Let's nonetheless go through my questions. So these are the is it effective questions. What's the input? The scenarios to be tried. What's the output? Utterances from the language models in the guises of lawyers and judge, and then the evaluation by a language model of those utterances. What are the other sources of data? Well, the language models are trained on some training data. Is there enough information in the input to determine the output? No, absolutely not. What are the failure modes? Nonsensical output. Possible causes of failure. This is just clear-cut, poor task tech fit. How is it evaluation? Apparently this is what's called a self-evaluation style thing. Which I don't quite get. Like the language models themselves are evaluating it. So they're just, off playing their own game with no connection to ground truth. Looking in the GitHub comments on this thing, one of the comments that the reviewers had for it is, well, it would be nice to have some other kinds of metrics, like maybe blue or rouge. And these are the metrics that are used for evaluating machine translation output and summarization. But crucially, both of those rely on comparison reference texts. How did someone else translate this? And that doesn't exist in this scenario, so that doesn't help. So this is not any serious proposal about how to do law with computation, but it is part of a serious proposal to create ambitious tasks as a proving ground for language models, and it was accepted into that. And so I think we should be worried. All right, the is it appropriate questions. How does it fit into human processes? Unknown. What information should the developer make transparent to the user? I would say what exactly a language model is and why it is in no way suited to these tasks. How does this shift or consolidate power? I would say if this were ever actually used, it would surely be extremely disempowering to the people who encounter it. Anyone trying to seek actual justice, if this were part of their justice system, would experience harm. And society at large would too, because there would be chaos. And is there a ground truth of right and wrong? No. Okay, I kind of rushed through that last one because it's not a very serious proposal, and I want to make sure to have plenty of time for discussions. So just to recap, my goals here were to give you hopefully some guidance as to how to scope NLP applications so that they are sensible, and how to detect wild claims, and maybe raise the level of knowledge a bit of NLP for people who are in policy discussions. The two key questions that I want everyone to ask if they're looking at legal NLP systems are, is it effective and is it appropriate? And once again, there's the link for my slides. Thank you so much. I really look forward to the questions.
This one is working.
Oh, yes, maybe you can. The roving mic. Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Yes. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate that and how you actually went into proposals or uses of legal tech and dissected them and developed a series of questions. Now, I heard you say in the beginning that it would be interesting that the people in the audience come up with a case and that we walk through that. Did I hear that correctly?
Yes, indeed. If people have cases, I'd love to do that.
Okay. So, do we have cases? Yes. Sorry, you. I don't remember your name, but you're at Tilburg University.
Thank you. I was wondering, and I'm steering maybe away from tech, but I want to ask you a very symmetrical question, because you make the statement that, yeah, of course, machines cannot understand language, but could you elaborate a bit on how a court, as a body, would understand, for instance, the Constitution? Because when you have the Supreme Court in the US, they have to look for what is the intent of the Constitution. And as you know, I'm wrong probably, so, but they have to see if a certain thing is constitutional. So they have to interpret the Constitution. So how do they relate to the intent of the Constitution, to the meaning of the Constitution, and so on? And just wondering, because when you have a shift in the how the Supreme Court is constituted, so which judges are in it, the judgments also change. And we see this with the, for instance, the Roe v. Wade thing that is retracted and so on. So how can possibly a court understand the Constitution?
Right. So I am not a lawyer nor a legal scholar. I'm a linguist. So I'll give you a linguist perspective on what I think is happening there, which is, so in linguistics, we start from sort of the most basic uses of language, which is co-present communication, where you are talking with somebody who's in the same space as you, and you have a lot of shared context. And it is what Herb Klock and others refer to as a joint activity. And I've just lost the name of that person, but someone else described intersubjectivity, where we collaborate together by jointly tracking a shared goal and each of our individual goals and what we believe the other person believes our goals are, and so on. And that is how we do language in the first instance. And in doing that, the words that we utter are not packages of meaning, but they are just clues to speaker intent. the law, documents like the Constitution, is a really interesting case, because that's a place where the communication is now distant, right? We're not co-present in space or time with people. We still apply those same techniques from our side of the conversation, where we say, okay, I am in conversation with this other person. These words came from a person. They didn't come from, the Constitution was written by people, and they're written by people. And now I'm getting into what I know there are big legal debates. They're written by people who lived in a specific time and place. And so when they use the words, they don't share my context now. I don't directly share their context, but what can I find out about how their context works? And none of this is simple or straightforward or, automatable in the sense of if you just do X, Y, and Z, you will get it right. And so there's a reason that in general, our system is supposed to be set up to select very thoughtful and independent people to be serving as the judges in those bodies, and to give them the time and space to be thoughtful and independent so that they can do their best to make those determinations. And clearly, you can see the human fallibility in that, and you can see the ways in which the systems are breaking down from protecting that independence. And that is personally very, very frustrating. Thank you for bringing up examples from my country. But it doesn't mean that it is replaceable through automation. And I think that when we think about automation, is one way of thinking about systems, but another way of thinking about systems are what are the systems that we put in place as a society, as I said, to select thoughtful and independent people and then maintain their ability to be thoughtful and independent once they're in that role. And I think those are the systems we should be looking to shore up rather than trying to automate this stuff. I hope that speaks to the question.
Whoa. I think I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 questions. That's great, and I'm going to address you in terms of your shirts, I'm afraid. And in this case, the person behind you was the first to raise his hand. Yes.
Hi, my name is Robert van Doesburg, and I work on normative systems. And I developed a method for the standardized interpretation of sources of law. And I do that by finding actions that are mentioned in law, and then look for conditions that make that actions valid, the result of those actions, and the person that are addressed by those actions. So one of the ways we try to test whether this is really a good standardized method is by using NLP to recognize elements in sources of law. For example, we've done this with the Dutch Aliens Act, and we asked and we tried to determine all the actions of things that someone can do that are written in that law, and all the actors that are mentioned, and all the objects that these actions are addressed to, and all the recipients of the results of those actions. That's what we're doing right now, which are the interpretations of single sentences. And the next step we want to do in the coming year is trying to find relations between different sentences. So mostly in legal text, you find the action of what a minister can do in one sentence, and then the conditions under which he can do it in another sentence or even in another document. So that's what we're trying to do with NLP in order to test whether our theory of interpretation of sources of law is so standardized that it can be optimized.
Yeah. So, got an echo going on. I like that as sort of at a first pass before we dive into the, is it effective and is it appropriate questions. As a task for NLP, you are asking the system to analyze linguistic structure. And that's the kind of thing that these systems are really well suited to. So what are the actions, right? What are the various ways in which they're expressed? Who are the actors? Who are the recipients? All of that is syntax and compositional semantics, and then looking at connections across sentences. That sounds like entity linking or co-reference resolution and coherence relations. So all of this is doing analysis of the linguistic structures in the documents so that the hypotheses you have about what shows up in laws, if I'm understanding correctly, can be tested against more data than you could hope to go through by hand. So that sounds to me very effective. So just very quickly, I'm looking at my is it effective slide projected. I don't know if you see the slides in the room right now. So what's the input? It sounds like the input is legal codes. What's the output? The output is going to be annotations over those codes showing actions and actors and recipients. Couldn't tell you about other sources of data being used. Is there enough information in the input to determine the output? I think yes, in this case, because you're talking about linguistic structures. Failure modes are going to be the usual ones, like it's going to miss some, it's going to mislabel some. And possible causes of failure are going to be, again, like how, if you're doing this with rule-based NLP, if you get to sentences that system can't parse, if you're doing it statistically, it's going to be things about parse selection problems and so on. And you would have to tell me how you're doing the evaluation of the specific tools that you're using. And then, oops, I have to switch my slides over here. It sounds like your automated task is you aren't using this to make decisions. You're using this to collect data to test a hypothesis. And that is a really good use of automation. And if within your project you have the people making the NLP systems, not the people using them, then you're going to want some good communication about where the causes and types of failure are. I can't off the top of my head talk to the power question here. And it seems like the harms of first of all, there is ground truth to right and wrong, and the harms of an incorrect output would be that it makes your evaluation of the bigger question you're asking a little bit more uncertain. So that was very quick, but I hope helpful. And I think a really interesting application of NLP technology in this field.
Harry first.
Hello, Emily. This is Harry Surden from the University of Colorado. Really enjoyed your talk, so thanks so much. One aspect I wanted to hear your thoughts on in what we see a lot of issues on the use of artificial intelligence by the government is today in some of the systems is the lack of technological and expert capacity to use these systems well, even if they're working correctly. So just to give you an example, we often see these systems developed by private parties that are sold to, judges for either, recidivism or sentencing predictions, or sold to the police force for facial recognition or license plate recognition. So even if these systems are working correctly, which there's, doubts to whether they are, they're sold as turnkey systems to the government that often doesn't have the capacity to use it well or contextualize results. So I wanted to hear your thoughts on that aspect. I'm sure that there are similar issues with NLP systems, even though those examples are not NLP within law, and how you think about that.
Yeah, I think that goes to this question of how does the automated task fit into human processes, and also information made transparent to the user by the developer. So what is the problem we're trying to solve, and what is the role of automation within it? And I think with the recidivism prediction, what part of the story there, wasn't it that it was actually the system was developed for something else, and then it got repurposed as recidivism prediction, which is, it was problematic in the first place, but that made it more so. And I was on a panel once with a fellow from the Washington chapter of the ACLU, whose name I don't remember, who made a wonderful point about that, which is, why is that the question we're asking? Why are we set up so that we're asking how likely is this person to reoffend, rather than what does this person need to reduce the likelihood of their reoffending? Right? There's this question of, when we set up processes where there's a question we have to ask it over and over and over again, we are shaping outcomes in the choice of question that we're asking. And when we automate that, then the effects of that get amplified, because if it's automated, it's cheap to use. And so we're going to rely on it more and more and more. And it can be done. If there's harms, the harms are going to be scaled. So I think it's really important to put a lot of thought into what tasks get automated. So why are we doing that task in the first place? Is it actually appropriate to automate? And then the user experience design, right? How well do the people interacting with it really understand what it is that it's doing? And oftentimes these things are very obscured by the way the systems are named. And so it matters a lot what you tell the person using it that the thing is, so that they have a much better sense of how it fits into their workflow and can sort of maintain power over it rather than ceding authority to automated systems that shouldn't be ceded. Hope that speaks to the question at least somewhat.
Is there, so there's Michael, there is Zenbing, and I think the person here on the front row. So is there somebody who's asking a question that's closely related to what was just discussed? Okay.
It's similar to Howard's question.
Sorry?
It's similar to
Okay, yeah, please.
I have. So yeah, especially with regards to this case study 3, so the criminal kind of criminal prediction case. I have the first is whether NLP is actually the better model compared to other maybe simpler statistical models. Like if NLP is over parameterization of a lot of things that's in the text. Because when I was a master's student in 2017 in Beijing, the Peking University professor did a similar kind of criminal sentencing statistical analysis, but not prediction at that time, with all the cases from not just the Supreme Court, but every case you can find on online about the drunk driving. So if, for example, if in Chinese criminal law, it's very clear on what kind of situations will make into like 2 to 3 years of imprisonment, and there's aggravation or kind of other kind of circumstances. It's like a tick box thing. At that time, the professor was hiring like law students to like tag kind of what are the positive and negative labels and to see what kind of the checklists. So it's like a simple statistical analysis to see the average means. The idea was not to kind of understand like the prediction of it, but to see whether it fits into the legal framework. For example, if there's a province where the judges really heavily sentencing people on crimes compared to another province where socioeconomic situation is different, can the Supreme Court use this tool to balancing the regional differences or their specific courts that may just be too heavy on sentencing? So that's not using it as a prediction tool, but maybe as a kind of a regulation of the court system itself within. So I was thinking first is NLP the best? And second, in terms of the use of these kind of systems, how instead of prediction, we can use it in other ways that may fit into a framework, which is really great. I benefit a lot from like going through each lines of it. But what if we change the idea of like how to use the statistical models?
Yeah, I really like how you're calling out where that prediction is the problem. Right now, the echo is the problem too. So there certainly is value in looking over what's happening and saying, are we seeing discrimination? Are we seeing differential application of the laws? And that definitely happens, at least in my society. I wouldn't be surprised if it happens elsewhere. Can the people in charge of the microphone turn off the one in the room so I don't have to hear myself? Thank you. Okay. And so then your second question was, is it better to do this with NLP versus other things? And if you're looking sort of, okay, we've got a whole bunch of court cases and we want to test hypotheses about patterns of discrimination, the value add of NLP is that it lets you go after unstructured data in those sources. And the risk that's added is you have to really carefully evaluate the NLP components to make sure that they are not adding too much noise, right? So if you're looking over the natural language descriptions of what the person was charged with and the other legal documents, and it is systematically missing information from a particular region, say because of dialect differences, then that's going to create problems down the line in testing your hypothesis. So I think there's potential value for NLP, but again, you have to come at it very critically. And if you're trying to scale to a larger data set by using NLP, you have to do a very strict evaluation of the NLP components to make sure that that scaling isn't just wishful thinking, where it looks like it's doing what you want, and you haven't evaluated it carefully enough to tell whether or not it really is.
Okay, I have Michael, I have you, but Masha wants to come in on this particular point, right? So just a comment, I think, yeah.
A very quick comment. I think this discussion also demonstrated sort of the issues that we have about understanding the tasks that we're doing in the first place. Because right now we're talking about predicting core decisions as if we were going to use that to make decisions. And this is like this paper, EMNLP paper also clearly did that by saying that it's going to be an automatic correction. But sort of, why do we even think about that in that way in the first place? Because if we're trying to predict the weather, we're not saying that if we predicted it wrong, that the weather was wrong, right? So we're not trying to prescribe it what it should be doing. So when we're predicting core decisions, and I work a lot on predicting core decisions, is if we can do it well, that we can maybe predict how a judge will predict something, but this is in no way a mechanism to make a decision. And it's a different algorithm than you would normally use to make a decision. So this is also sort of this is more of a comment, but this also demonstrates how even like the tasks that we sort of think that we understand, they also, like, there might be a different goal behind it. I don't know. That's it.
Yeah, to reply to your comment with a comment, I think it's really important to lay out what those goals are. And I also think that the word predict all across computer science is hugely problematic. When people claim to be predicting things, it's usually not prediction. It's usually retrospective anyway. So I think that word would be one that we would be well advised to set aside and then come up with ways of describing the task that better reflect the goals of the task.
Put an article of Masha in the stream where she's making that point precisely. So the difference between prediction as used in NLP and forecasting and distinguishing it from categorization and identification of outcome. I have Michael person in front of me, and I think that's Sol. So I don't know who was first. Michael?
Thanks, Emily. It's Michael Veal from UCL. I wanted to ask a question, for you as a linguist, and me definitely not as a linguist, and looking at your history of grammars and software. When people issue commands to computers, not with large language models and so on, but normal commands, they do so knowing that the computer doesn't understand their environment and knowing that the computer doesn't have that kind of meaning. And it's maybe that's not a communication, but we issue an order or command that way. And when we teach that to students how to do that, we sometimes describe it as algorithmic thinking, how to write in a way that gets the outcome you want from a computer to say, okay, for this, then, while this command is true, blah, blah, execute this this command and so on. And that's a really hard thing to teach. But we also then see some moves where to automate normal jobs, to help people achieve more from computers, those kind of commands become more like natural language, right? We don't have to talk in code or a programming language anymore, but people still learn to express automation, express specific computational tasks through language. And what I don't know is how do linguists see that? Like, what are humans doing in that situation when they're kind of adjusting to what they think the computer is aware of and not aware of in order to achieve a specified outcome? Is that something that linguists have a perspective on, and maybe you can shine light on what that might be? Because it seems like that's still a useful thing to do and to preserve and to learn how we do more of in the world.
Yeah, this is not something I spent a lot of time thinking about. So these are sort of off the cuff answers, and there may well be people who think about this. one of the very big differences between programming languages and natural languages is that programming languages are specifically designed to be unambiguous. And that's because a lot of what we do that computers can't is resolve the ambiguity of human language, that we're selecting among the possible standing meanings based on everything we know about what the possible communicative intent could be to help narrow it down. And it would be chaos if computers were doing that, right? We want computers as machines to reliably give the same answer to the same question every single time. And so these are designed quite differently. And this idea of in sociolinguistics is called audience design, where you change the way you speak based on the people you're speaking to. It would be interesting to look at the way people interact with natural language interfaces to computers through the lens of audience design, and how it is that people learn to speak in a certain way to get the effect that they want out of the computer, and what those learning trajectories look like. And then an additional question that I would be interested in is, to what extent does having the interface look too much like the way you would talk to a person make it harder for people to have a clear model of what it is the computer can and can't do? Where, like, if you have to adopt the computer's weird language, that changes expectations of what it can do. Possibly also false expectations in some ways, but I think that would be a really interesting study if it hasn't been done.
Fantastic. Last question. Please introduce yourself.
Okay, thank you very much. Should I look over there? Maurizio here from Italy, Chieti Pescara. And I'm the last one, so I'll try to be brief. I'm fascinated by the topic of the intent. You say that the understanding the meaning of language of a sentence would be to understand the intents and not what are the written words given the expression. I was wondering whether one could model the notion of intent in some sense and build in this way an annotated data set for language models that you can use for training a language model. And if the answer is yes, if you think, as a linguist expert, that training in this way on intents instead of just the I don't remember the word you were using, that would go towards a language model that is really understand the meaning.
Yeah.
I don't know if this is clear.
So if the training data has not just form, but pairings of form and intent, then a model trained on that data could plausibly pick up information about the intent. I still think it's a very, very hard problem, and it would be interesting to look at. It becomes murky to evaluate, because even the ones trained just on form can produce outputs that we can make sense of. So coming up with the evaluations that will actually tease that apart is really non-trivial, and I think that's what the big bench folks were trying to do. And some of their tasks might well be better suited. So the argument from Bender and Kohler is just, look, if there's only form in the input, then you're only ever going to learn form. And if you want to build a system that can learn either standing meaning or intent, then that's got to be in the training data. What remains an open, interesting question is whether something like the basic architectures we have for next word prediction could take advantage of form meaning or form intent pairs, and learn the compositional and also common sense reasoning that it would need to be able to do what we do. And there is work where it's not form and intent, but form and meaning representation. So I'm thinking of the work by Jan Boyce and Wei Sun and others, who learn parsing systems. So the training data has the surface strings and semantic representations, and they build systems that are very good at producing semantic representations for new strings. And so those systems probably have picked up on some of the compositional stuff going on. But the additional layer to get to communicative intent involves a whole different kind of inputs and reasoning about coherence and world knowledge and shared common sense. And I think those are really open, difficult problems, and not ones that I would expect to get very far with just by taking massive data sets and trying to learn patterns. But the sort of, in order to even answer that question, we need much better evaluations. I hope that speaks to your question.
The drinks are patiently waiting.
Yes. I understand. I guess it's a very hard task. Would you think that restricting to the domain of law, which is what we are interested mainly here, would help in making life easier?
Restricting to a specific domain, definitely, but law is so broad that I don't think if you say just restricted to the domain of law, it's still kind of everything, isn't it? So I'm not sure that helps in your case.
Okay, thank you very much. I would say that interpretation theory does not restrict meaning to intent at all, especially not when you talk about written language, because the moment that the author spoke and the moment that the reader reads is often very different. And I do know that there's some archaic sense in some parts of United States law that think it's all about framers' intent. Sorry about this. But I would say that's 19th century, and we have passed that by. But anyway, I'm absolutely delighted. Thank you very much for the keynote. I'm also very much impressed with the fact that at 5 o'clock, after how many hours, I can't count, but very many hours of very intense listening to often talks from a very different perspective than your own, we come up with all these questions. And Emily, thank you for giving a talk that at this hour raises all these questions, and thank you very much to the audience for being so, with such acuity, being here. Thank you very much. Applaud also for yourself.